And we're live. Hello again. It's been a while since I produced one of these videos. Hopefully it goes okay this time. Hopefully that mouse won't. I don't think it's going to go away. Okay, so just as a review, this is section 5 of music. We're overviewing the propaganda use of music during the Cold War. Propaganda is a fact of life. Since the genesis of the first civilization, government has tried all that was within its power to persuade the average citizen to think like they would want them to become martyrs for the sake of capitalism, communism, whatever they advocate. The Cold War was a period of strife and intercontinental hostility, so it spawned the propaganda boom to dwarf all others of the modern age. Nothing was safe or sacred from governmental use, especially in the USSR, because, communism. The music industry was among the major power players in the propaganda production. That's a lot of P's. With both sides cranking out pieces so they can declare themselves culturally superior. Now, back at the very beginning, the OWI, Office of War Information, was a propaganda producing government machine established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, to educate the Axis and allied forces of America's high moral standings in World War II. They started their barrage of radio waves upon Germany. Please forgive me, I'm reading a script I wrote, so I can't be, having a natural flow. To educate the Axis and allied forces of America's high moral standings in World War II. They started their barrage of radio waves upon Germany with programs such as Salute to France and Voice of America, which is still running today, just not to such a large extent. Operas and classical pieces were prominently featured on the airwaves because the U.S. made heavy use of radio, trying to convince Axis citizens to defect to the technologically and culturally superior combatant. The Germans had tons of propaganda too, of course, but we're focusing on the Cold War here, not World War II. And this is set up for the Cold War. The Voice of America, the organization I mentioned earlier, broadcasted exclusively abroad because the U.S. wanted to avoid becoming a propaganda state like Germany. Of course, domestic policy had changed a bit by the 50s. OWI was disbanded just a little while after the end of the war. In Russia, classical was the music of choice, mainly due to Russia being and this was a painful thorn in their side. And remember, Russia is the largest nation within the USSR. They were the one of the last feudal nations on Earth up to World War One, and that meant they had been a lot less advanced scientifically, culturally, for a very long time. So Russia started doing whatever it could to pump out a bunch of classical pieces because they wanted to prove to the world that they were, culturally advanced, that they could compete with the modern uh, society, the modern standings. However, their method for acquiring musical talent was still could be considered feudal in some ways. It was draconian and brutal. Children who were found to be prodigies were sent, whether they liked it or not, to special boarding schools in which they were often expected to study 12 hours a day or more. They suffered from many diseases and often, sleep deprivation because of this. China still does stuff like this today. Okay. VOX, the Russian acronym for All Union Society for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries, was in charge of the propaganda machine and the distribution of music. Sorry, I've also got a bit of a head cold, so I can't talk coherently. Russia was still rather sensitive about having, yeah, I got through that already. Yeah, this was to show Russian cultural superiority, and it was also to establish Russia as a cultural hub of sorts for all of its satellite states and, just small third world countries to kind of meld into, be assimilated, and become eventually prospective parts of the USSR. In a very short time, the USSR became the lead competitor in global competitions. They dominated in chess and later in musicals, even written about the practice of chess diplomacy, I guess you could call it, during the Cold War. Guess what the musical was called? Chess. USSR was known to commit small atrocities that today I suppose are common to help it get an edge in a lot of competitions. Seen here are all the musical awards they won. Again, they kind of did child slavery at some levels to get that edge in the musical competitions. And their Olympic competitors were often drugged in one way or another. Often it was steroids. But yes, it overall made the USSR a force to be reckoned with on the international competition level. And for a long time, they were on the leaderboards in almost everything. They won more than 10 international music competitions of high prestige in the 1950s, and yeah, a lot of them were piano and violin. So what I have here is a picture of Mexico and the U.S., but you'll have to imagine that Mexican flag as a stand-in for all the Latin American countries. I believe that because, there's nothing really visually pleasing. That's all of them together. So keep that in mind. The Pan American Union was formed by the U.S. to combat Axis propaganda during World War II in Latin countries. So if you're noticing a pattern here, it's that a lot of the Cold War institutions, a lot of the stuff was actually formed during World War II. There was already hostility. And going off on a tangent, one of the most famous generals of the Cold War, General Patton, was actually a strong advocate for during the Cold War. Uh, he died before a lot of the Cold War stuff came into play due to complications from a car accident, though, so you don't really hear him referenced much. Um, yeah, and as you know, Germany tried to get Mexico to declare war against the U.S., so this Pan American Union was most likely a direct response to that. And its goal was to exchange musical talent and thus goodwill. Its legacy affected U.S. foreign policy after its disbandment, causing politicians to favor a more propaganda oriented approach, a more let's tell these other nations how great we are type of thing. And a rising number of third world countries had popped up after World War II as well, because the British had begun decolonizing and a lot of colonies had begun rebelling. So there was a fresh crop of states ready to be made satellites. And yes, the Smith-Mundt Act was passed as such. And I bet you could guess what that is by this point. It's an act to increase propaganda. The USIA, or U.S. Information Agency, essentially just a replacement for the OWI, or Office of War Information, directly combated the USSR threat of cultural superiority by funding orchestras and ballet dancers. Now, this is either four-dimensional chess, or this is really profoundly dumb on the part of both players. Now, what we have here is a picture taken from Porgy and Bess, or at least a recent rendition of it. And Porgy and Bess was very important as a propaganda piece during the Cold War and even during World War II. It was written by George and Ira Gershwin, or Gershwin, and they were both, obviously, they were brothers, and they were both songwriters. Porgy and Bess was a result of years of work, and unfortunately, George died before it hit the theater. Luckily, before his death, he had left quite a legacy in classical jazz fusion and other weird niche forms of musical genres he had either made up himself or revived. The best example of this is Rhapsody in Blue, and I suppose the area where you would find Rhapsody in Blue used most today it was featured in Disney's Fantasia, the original one. Uh, it was a depiction of a Boston street. Um, yeah, if that rings a bell. It had blues uh, chords in it. It. However, it would go on to be a Porgy and Bess would go on to be a smash hit both in the US and USSR, as well as Germany, as one of the few pieces of American performance to be allowed and even encouraged by government authorities on both sides of the conflict. Both conflicts, because we're considering World War II in this as well. Porgy received its recognition after a tour of Broadway, as so many great musical theater discoveries, I suppose I would call them, do. And critics were somewhat divided as to whether it classified as an opera or a musical, an opera being essentially something where all the lines are sung. So if you think about it, Hamilton was an opera, which would explain why I didn't really like it that much, and unpopular opinion, but yeah. But they couldn't figure out whether it was an opera or musical because it was using operatic technique or whatever, or however you pronounce it. It was speech-like singing. It was a sort of a way of singing that didn't ramp up or lower down. The voice stayed relatively flat. And yes, it's used commonly in opera and is considered a trait of opera. After its US tour, back to the propaganda, Porgy headed to Axis control of Europe. I think it was Hungary, uh, and performed all scheduled shows to great success, except the last one, which was shut down by a threat of bombing by the Nazis who were in control in that part of Europe at that time. However, years later, the show caught back on, and it was still running, and the US looked at it and they thought this has great propaganda value. All of these actors are black. The main criticism against us the Soviet Union has is that we are racist. That's what they keep saying. So if we send this show to the Soviet Union with all black actors, we will dispel their propaganda and instill some of our own. Uh, plot wise, Porgy and Bess was about kind of a ghetto type family, or not family. It was about a crippled guy, as you can clearly see from the poster, and as it was described, his drug addicted girlfriend and her abusive ex boyfriend, and there's a drug dealer in the mix, and the whole shebang. Anyway, by the US to have propaganda value, uh, the Soviets actually liked it. Um, it began its USSR tour in 1955, making it the first American play in that country since 1917. And this kind of spawned the same excitement as the first McDonald's in the USSR did. It brought even the highest of USSR society politely waiting in line for the theater. Uh, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Enjoy your day. And don't waste 15 minutes of your time acting listening to some kid who doesn't know what he's talking about talking either. That's me.